All right. There we go. Boom. Okay, so Revelation 10 tonight. Let's take a look at the text here. I've told you a couple of times, I wish, get a little bit more normal, kind of regular. If you're in the wrong book of the Bible for that. We're got a lot more imagery tonight, so let's unpack it. Revelation 10. The Bible says, "Then I saw another mighty angel," I being John, of course. "I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He held a little scroll open in his hand, setting his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. He gave a great shout, like a lion roaring. And when he shouted, the seven thunders sounded. And when the seven thunders had sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down.' Then the angel whom I saw standing on the sea and the land raised his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it. There will be no more delay. But in the days when the seventh angel is to blow his trumpet, the mystery of God will be fulfilled, as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Then the voice that I had heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, 'Go, take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land.' So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll, and he said to me, 'Take it and eat. It will be bitter to your stomach, but sweet as honey in your mouth.' So I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. Then they said to me, 'You must prophesy again about many peoples and nations and languages and kings.'" Okay, so let's break it down. Okay, the center of this chapter is this little scroll. This little open scroll is really kind of the center of the chapter. Now, John tells us that the scroll appears in the hand of a mighty angel, and then it's eaten by the prophet John. Now, there's a parallel scene to this. We go back and we look in Revelation 5:2. We read these words. I'll begin at verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 2. John says, "Then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?'" So we have a parallel here with Revelation 5, where a mighty angel introduces the sealed scroll. Now, this little scroll, this is kind of the midpoint of Revelation. We're kind of right here in the middle of the book. It's kind of reminiscent of, if you've read the prophets, when a prophet receives his call and is charged with his task, right? Now, such a vision like this is seen actually in Ezekiel in chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. But as you would surmise, there are significant and probably intentional differences to what is going on here. You see, Ezekiel is not sent to speak to foreign people. Ezekiel is only meant to speak to whom? Yeah, the people of Israel. Right. Good, Crystal. He's sent only to speak to the house of Israel. Now, the rebellious nature of Ezekiel's task, of the people, because they're rebels. God says they're rebels over and over and over again in Ezekiel. God speaks about the rebellious house of Israel over and over again. But their nature, that makes Ezekiel's task a bitter one. Because Ezekiel knows up front they're not going to listen. It reminds me of Isaiah's call. Often that text is read at ordination services. Here am I, who will go for us? Who will speak the word? Here am I, send me. And we've even got a disciples hymn. I don't know how it ever became the disciples hymn, but here am I, Lord, and all that stuff. But we don't read on to what God actually says to Isaiah after he says, here am I, send me. Because then God says, okay, go ahead and speak to these people, but they're not going to listen. Preach, they won't understand. Their ears are stopped up. They won't turn. So anybody want to take that church? Anybody want to be the pastor of that church? Preach, teach. They're not going to listen. Their hearts are hard. They've turned to idols. So that makes Ezekiel's task bitter. But in John's case, here's what's awesome. In John's case, the bitterness of his task is speaking his prophecy to many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. Now, one of these nations is killing God's people, both Jews and Christians, by the thousands. And who might that be?
Germans.
The Romans. Yeah. The Romans. One of these peoples that John has to speak to is right now currently slaughtering Jews and Christians by the thousands. And it's Rome. Okay. So what we have here is John is conveying this message to them, and he's going to be doing it kind of play acting. He's going to be doing like dramatizations. They're called sign acts. The prophet symbolizes a message by acting out the scene. Have you ever played charades? Yeah, kind of the same thing, just a lot more important. That has to do with real things and God's message to the people. One of the ones that you may be familiar with is in Jeremiah 27. Jeremiah constructs and wears a yoke around his neck and walks around. He does this to encourage the people of Israel to accept the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, which they don't want to do. But this is God's desire for them, is that they will accept. The exile is going to happen. Go ahead and accept the yoke of God around your neck. Accept Nebuchadnezzar. Go into exile. And they didn't want to, obviously, they didn't want to do that. But that was one of the ones that's more familiar. Ezekiel also has his own play acts as well, his sign acts as well. Now, here's one of the things we need to know about prophets. Well, let me ask you, what are and anybody on Zoom that wants to chime in, just hit your space bar and chime in. But what are prophets' characteristics? What are some of the characteristics of prophets? When you think about prophets,
They foretell.
Okay, they foretell. Okay, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you thinking eccentric?
Yeah, they're eccentric. Yeah, they're eccentric. They're kind of loony, kind of crazy, foolish.
Weird's a good name too.
Weird. John the Baptist. You remember him, right?
Yeah.
8 bucks with wild honey, as if that made it go down any better. And wore camel's hair. But yeah, they're so bizarre. But there's an interesting thing here in the ancient world. The link between bizarre behavior and holiness was more obvious to them than it is to us. We tend to think of our holy people as kind of having it all together. We kind of think of them as people they're not eccentric. They're not crazy. They're not,
Cool, calm, and collected.
cool, calm, and collected. You don't want to go sit in the office with some pastor who's eating locusts and wild honey and hasn't brushed his hair in a while. We want our leaders, our holiness, see a cool, calm, collected speaks of the kind of, when we think of holiness, at least most of us. But there is an honored place in Scripture for those who are willing to appear as fools in the course of being obedient to God. There is a divine place for folks who will be foolish for Christ's sake. Okay, so that's that. Okay, look with me at verses 3-7. That's kind of an introduction to this chapter. But there is a suggestion here of 7 thunders. And again, when we encounter that number 7, it's kind of a poetic way of speaking about God. The image for God's voice is frequent in Scripture in Deuteronomy 5. All right, I love that ringtone. In Deuteronomy 5, it speaks of God speaking in thunder. Psalm 29, verses 3-9, talks about the voice of God as thunder. Sometimes the Bible, like in John 12, quite literally suggests that thunder is God speaking. It said that there was thunder. Jesus heard a divine voice. We're not told what it says. But Jesus hears a divine voice, and it sounded like thunder to the folks that were around him. And he says, that voice wasn't for my benefit. It was for your benefit, so that you may know that I am the one. And so there is that. Now, Revelation 10:4. Let's look at that again. And when the 7 thunders had sounded, I was about to write. But I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the 7 thunders have said and do not write it down. Now, that's strange. That is strange, isn't it? Why would you not write it down? There are a lot of ideas. Scholars have come up with all kinds of ideas about why not write it down. I'm just going to give you 2. Okay. In contrast with reports of the Old Testament prophets, Revelation never portrays God as speaking directly with humans. Have you ever noticed that? God does not speak directly to humans in Revelation. He does in the prophets. Okay. But on many occasions, we get like a voice or voices from heaven that speak. But the words of these voices, it's a heavenly mandate that they're giving us. But because Revelation is seriously concerned about the contamination of idolatrous Roman cults, it is not surprising that John would be reluctant to describe a human-like God who can be easily contained by a literal quotation. And what we mean by that is they already had enough of those gods, kind of human-like, floating around out there. So to describe God this way would be it would add more weight to the Roman imperial cults. So we had enough of that. All right. So that's one idea. The God of Revelation must remain sovereign in every sense. Now, the other one is what we got coming up in chapters 12-14, I believe is probably the content of the little scroll. What we have there is in narrative action and story form, the content of the scroll. So it's better to have the prophet wait. Don't give away the whole story right at the beginning. Just keep something. Keep something. So it's better to have the prophet wait and witness the content firsthand than to write it down now. And this, it gives it a little bit of urgency and a little bit of drama. So that's maybe one of the other things that's going on here. One more thing in these verses. Look with me at verse 7, if you would. It says, but in the days when the 7th angel is to blow his trumpet, the mystery of God will be fulfilled as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Now that word mystery is absolutely pregnant with meaning. The Gospel of Mark and here in Revelation, it's the Greek word mysterion. It's where we get our word, obviously, mystery, but it's often translated secret. But here it's translated as mystery. Now, Colossians 2:2 says, Christ is God's mystery personified. So he says, we could kind of say the kingdom of Christ in all its fullness will not be delayed. In other words, what he's saying, the mystery of God. The kingdom of Christ in all its fullness will not be delayed. So this is the message that the mighty angel gives here. And it's another thing, because it will not be delayed. But have you caught on yet? What chapter are we in? 10, right? How many chapters are there in Revelation? 22. So obviously it's not going to happen right now because we still got 12 chapters left in this book. I think one of the things here that it does say to us is reminding us of something that Jesus told us. We're constantly warned not to grow lax during the delay of Christ's coming. We're told to be ready all the time. but it will not be delayed. And so I think that probably has to do, at least in the initial context here in Revelation, with the events of 12 through 14, which we're going to get to in the course of things. All right, I just got a couple more things to say here about 10, and then I want to make some application with you guys. It's interesting where the call of John comes, because we've been with him since, well, the beginning, but it comes here. John gets his prophetic call here in chapter 10. It would have made a lot more sense if it had happened earlier, but this has happened before in the Bible. In Isaiah prophesies 5 chapters, and then he's called in Isaiah 6. So it's interesting to note that this isn't the first time, but I think one of the answers here is it's connected with the 2 martyred prophets in Revelation 11. It's kind of these 2 prophets, and John, of course, it's kind of putting the prophetic ministry of all prophets from Moses right up to John together. Okay. And this perspective causes us to pause to recognize the role of prophecy suggested by Revelation. What is a prophet supposed to do in Revelation? Well, he's supposed to give guidance to the people of God. That's what a prophet does. A lot of times we think of a prophet as predicting the future. That is part of a prophet's job, but more often than not, it is to guide the people of God. Let me take you back to the Apostle Paul and put some meat on these bones. The Apostle Paul tells the church in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians, talking about worship, talking about these people that are speaking in tongues and it's getting out of control. He doesn't say they shouldn't. He just says it's getting out of control and it's taking over the worship service. Worship should be orderly. Let's have 2 or 3 people speak in tongues, but there must be interpretation. If there is no interpretation, then you should not be speaking in tongues. But then he goes on to say, I would rather prophesy. I would rather prophesy than speak in tongues. I would rather utter 1,000 words in prophecy than 10 words in a tongue, because prophecy is for the upbuilding of the body of believers. People can understand what you're saying, unlike tongues, which we'll get to that if we ever study 1 Corinthians. I hope we do. And tongues seems to be more of an ecstatic expression of worship between the individual believer and God. Okay. But prophecy in that regard, I'm recalling Philip, the evangelist who baptized the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts. We're told that Paul visits him late in the book of Acts, and he has 7 unmarried daughters who prophesy. And the word that's used there is the word for preach. That's what it means. Preach, guide. So I just want to get that out of the way, that a lot of times we think of prophets as foretelling the future, and it's just all about, that, but not always. The prophet's role is one of preparation, one of guidance. Think of John the Baptist as well. He was preparing the people, getting them ready for the coming of Jesus. So I just want to throw that out there. Okay. So in a way, all of us that are preachers, we fulfill a prophetic function just by merely teaching and guiding, and more than predicting the future per se. Okay. So let me see here. I've got a lot of notes, but I don't want to give you sensory overload. Obviously, this is a remarkable auditory and visual experience for John, but it's not for his private benefit and for his enjoyment. None of this is just for him. Prophecy is intended to help people understand God's will for the present. And when the message is announced, it's often misunderstood. Have you noticed that? Mm-hmm. Even when the message is understood, it's usually rejected by the majority of those for whom it is intended. Jesus's words, the kingdom of God is here now. And most people didn't understand it. They didn't want it. They didn't want it. They didn't want to understand it. And then one other thing here is that Revelation's viewpoint is that just as Jesus remained faithful and triumphed by his testimony to the truth, so also prophets can. They can remain faithful and true if they testify in a way consistent with the witness of Jesus. The Greek word for testimony is martyria. and the word for martyr is martus. They come from the same root. This obvious intimate connection makes the point of revelation eloquently. What was the final testimony of Jesus? It was to surrender to a martyr's death. The final witness of the representative two prophets that we're going to meet in Revelation 11 is martyrdom in the same city where Jesus was crucified. So that's sometimes we're called to that. Now, before we get to Revelation 11, I want to jump us out of, because that's a lot. That's a lot. There's a lot going on here. But I want to ask you a question. Have you had any life experiences that have been both bitter and sweet? If you have, talk about it. Bitter and sweet.
At the same time?
Yeah. Have you had any life experiences that have been both bitter and sweet? Let's hear it. Whoever would like to speak.
I have.
Okay, I'd like to tell you, my mother died, how many years ago? Am I talking loud enough? My mother died about 25 years ago.
Okay.
She comes to me all the time and I'm wondering if I'm going crazy. She tells me how to take my medicine. And now she stopped. Now my father is. And I'm getting a little bit worried, maybe I'm crazy, but it's beautiful. Whatever they come and tell me, it's beautiful. So my mother stopped and I'm praying to God that she comes back. I miss her. And I asked the other pastor, I said, am I crazy? You know, maybe I've got Alzheimer's. He had Alzheimer's, you don't remember nothing. He says, but I don't think it's that. I've got 7 doctors working on this and they can't figure it out.
Well,
What that doesn't appear to me.
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Jennifer, you had something you're going to share.
Bitter and sweet at the same time. When I quit my job,
Yeah.
it was a relief to be out from under, because it was kind of choking me.
Right.
But I had been there for so long. It was very bitter and sad.
Sure.
It's like a breakup.
So it's bitter and it was sweet. That's good. Crystal.
The birth of my granddaughter
Okay. The birth of Zoe. Yeah.
and all that entails.
Yeah.
Up until this day, this very moment, and how sweet she is. And sometimes I want to. That's the bitter part.
I hear you.
For a second.
Okay. Who
For
else?
me,
Yes, ma'am.
when my dad passed away in
I don't know who that is.
I led my
It's
life
Rose.
to the Lord. Yeah.
So that ended up being a sweet
Yeah.
occasion. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was like God said, well, Daddy had to go, but here you have led 2 people.
There you go.
Mhm.
Rose is talking about when her father passed away, she led 2 people to the Lord.
My
So
2 brothers.
her 2 brothers, actually. So there's a bitter occasion which turns sweet. And one of the things that we life experiences, they are a lot of times the important tasks that we have, and a lot of our experiences can be both, or often both. And they can be, but a lot of times our experiences, it's when we allow the bitterness to fester, that's when the problems can come. And so we just have to be cognizant and prayerful of that. Now, the biographies of people that have made significant contributions to the church and society, they speak about experiences of conflict. They talk about proposing changes that are stubbornly resisted by others. Jesus, I mean, I only need to go to Jesus but we've been in church, all of us, long enough to know that even in the local church, there are changes that just really need to be made. But for some reason or the other, there is stubborn resistance from some to the change. Sometimes it's just change. I'm not a big guy on change for change's sake. I don't think that's all that fun, but sometimes there need to be changes for the upbuilding of the kingdom. And so that's where conflict can take hold. For instance, in our world, you think about the anti-slavery movement, the women's liberation movement. the growing pursuit of equality for a variety of minority groups, which is still going on. All of these movements have depended on countless women and men who sacrificed themselves for a cause that they felt was essential to human welfare and dignity. Okay. Some in their experiences in bitterness, some in despair, but most recall something sweet about their involvement. They really do. Now, not all social reform movements are of equal worth. They're not all, but most fair-minded people, you admire the courage and the commitment of those who care enough to try to change things for the better. And those who do get involved sometimes find it to be a very bittersweet experience. Perhaps here at New Hope, sometimes we face challenges. Sometimes they can be overwhelming. Decisions can be overwhelming. The question that this text posits for us, Revelation 10 posits for us tonight, is how are we, and it's not just me, I mean, it's all the folks that the whole church membership is either an elder, deacon, or deacon, whatever, or a large majority of it. Okay, but the thing is how are we to be faithful to this text that says you're going to do something, it's going to be sweet in your mouth, it's going to be bitter in your stomach. How are we to be faithful to this text when those circumstances arise, when we have those times? Certainly one aspect concerns that we need to recognize that actions are never purely sweet as honey. They're never really purely sweet as honey, okay? John's experience suggests that sourness, which I would define as the bitterness of conflict. By the way, there's healthy conflict. There is healthy conflict for organizations. The bitterness of conflict, suffering, opposition, and misunderstanding, and so on, is almost always part of the most important actions we take in life. It's almost always part. It's very rare that we'll say, hey, let's do this. And then everybody says, yeah, that's fine. Everybody just gets on like a Milky Way. Just smooth. No peanuts like Snickers, right? Just smooth, right? Yeah. Smooth. Yeah, but very rarely does that ever happen. Okay, so I think that's one of the things that Revelation 10 is teaching us tonight. So anybody got anything else on 10 before we move to 11? You have any questions of the text that you would like for me to try to fall all over? Yeah, Crystal.
Well, I was reading it almost at the top of the end of Revelation. And I just want to say how bittersweet reminds me of the lion and the...
Yeah.
Right.
The bittersweet, Crystal said, reminds her of the lion and the lamb. See, we have that lion and the lamb. So there's the sweetness of the lamb, but the kind of bitterness that we might associate with the king of the jungle. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's good.
The Messiah.
That's good.
The Messiah.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. All right, let's jump to 11. All right. So we have this vision. John gets his call. We see John taking his place in the line of the prophets like Moses. And now let's see what happens next. Okay. Then I, John, was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. All right, so let's just stop right there. All right, that's enough. Let me go ahead and just kind of take on the numbers here. If we look in verse 2, 42 months is 3.5 years. 1,260 days is approximately 3.5 years. What we have is an incomplete amount of time. We also have half of 7. So that's important for us to remember, is that what we're dealing with here is not 7. We're not dealing with completion. We're dealing with incompletion here. So I think that's one of the things that I would like to tell you there. Now, the temple here that they're talking about is indeed the temple in Jerusalem that John is asked to measure. One problem with that is by the time this was written, what had already happened? The temple had been destroyed by the Romans. The temple in Jerusalem had already been sacked. But remember, we're in a prophetic vision here. So, Titus, the emperor, not the emperor Titus, but the Roman general Titus and his armies swarmed Jerusalem. And I think I may have mentioned this before, that Josephus said they ran out of wood because they had crucified so many Jews that they started nailing them up on the walls outside of Jerusalem. It was a terrible time. Men, women, children exterminated. Eventually, what ends up happening with Israel is the zealots take hold. And I don't know if you remember, the zealots are the ones like Barabbas. Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He was a zealot. Jesus had a zealot as a disciple, Simon the Rebel, as he's called in Cotton Patch Gospel. But he's a zealot. And the zealots, their idea of handling things in Israel in the first century was to kill the Romans. Okay. Eventually that took sway in the late 60s in the first century. And so the Jews revolted against the Romans, and the Romans, it took 4 years, but when all was said and done, the Romans had obliterated the Jews in Israel and destroyed the temple and burned the city to the ground. And a lot of scholars believe that this is what Jesus was talking about in his little apocalypse when he was talking about, because they asked him, Lord, he says, these stones, one of these will be on top of another. And they said, well, tell us when these things are going to be. And then he tells them, he says, within a generation, some of you will not taste death until you see the kingdom of God come with power. And the destruction of Rome, of Jerusalem, vindicates Jesus as Messiah. He prophesied it, and it vindicated his words. And this was God's judgment on Jerusalem and on the Jews at that time. So that's terrible. Yeah, Gail, go ahead.
What's significant about measuring the temple?
Yeah, that's good. I was going to get to that right now. Measuring the temple is significant in the sense that, and I'm looking here in my book, in the sense that wanted to make sure that there was enough room for all of those who would still come to worship God, that there was still a sanctuary for those Christians and presumably Jews who were still worshiping God, a place to come. Now, what is most significant here is that it didn't include the court of the Gentiles. Okay. Now, the reason for not including that is, I guess it has to do with something about excluding those who have not remained faithful to Jesus. Perhaps those that have remained faithful measure off the inner areas of the temple for them, but do not measure the court of the Gentiles, where those that are not faithful would be. That's probably the best answer to give to that. Now, ironically, have you seen the portion of the wall in Jerusalem of the temple that is still there? They call it the Wailing Wall. You seen that? That's actually the wall outside of the court of the Gentiles. It's the only piece of the temple to survive, is actually right there. The western wall of the Herodian temple formed one of the boundaries of the Gentile court, and you can see it in Jerusalem today. But I think that it is basically those that are not faithful to Jesus are to stay in the court of the Gentiles, and those that are faithful are to be protected and measured off inside. So I think that's probably the best answer that I can give to that, and that's a great question. Now, what we have here, so what we talk about here is the two witnesses. The Bible calls them two olive trees. And have you ever seen any of the olive trees over there? Have you ever seen how old they are and gnarled? If you can Google it, olive trees in Israel, these trees are old. And they're cultivated particularly in Palestine, and they're noted for their strength, their age, and their dependability. Now, one of the kinds of trees that the Jews could not cut down ever were fruit trees. Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 and 20. Those trees would have primarily been olive trees. So to say that these guys are olive trees is to say that they are strong and dependable. All right. So to say the lampstands in verse 4, it may represent the entire church as enlightened by the prophetic ministry of John and others like him. And that's a little remote, but the idea is essential to understanding Revelation. So what we got here is the affirmation suggests that without prophecy, the church cannot be a light in the world. So if you have a church that's not speaking truth and not being light to the world, then you can't, if there's no prophecy. And again, I don't mean somebody that stands up and says, I believe James is going to win the lottery next week. I'd have to play it, one, and two, and that's not a statement on whether you should or not. It's just I don't. I buy comic books instead. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, I think in 5 years, New Hope's going to be this or that. Okay. No, it's this preaching of the word, this faithful testimony to the love of Jesus for us and for the world. And so I just want to kind of reiterate that as well. And that's what these two dudes are doing out here in this image. They're preaching. All right. Okay. So, and then we move on. And where did I just read through 3, didn't I? I have jumped ahead, haven't I?
Yeah.
James Shelton. All right, there we go. Let me keep going. I'm having so much fun. Hang in there. Here we go. These are the 2 olive trees. I've already mentioned them. And the 2 lampstands, Lord, that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, check this out. Fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut the sky so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Now, there are some just dead giveaways as to the identity of these 2 prophets right here. Do you remember which prophet in the Old Testament prayed to God that it would not rain and it didn't? Someone tell me. For 3.5 years. Elijah. And how about this other guy? Moses. They have authority over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Now, this for me recalls the Transfiguration, where Moses and Elijah are said to have met with Jesus on the mountain when he was transfigured. And what Moses and Elijah represent in that particular story is the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. They are the law and the prophets. Moses, Torah. He's the writer of the Torah. He is the one that led them out, the first prophet, right? The prophet Moses. And then you have the prophet Elijah, and they represent the tradition of Israel, the family of Israel. Jesus, New Covenant and Old Covenant coming together right there on that mountain. And so here again, the identity that is given to these 2 individuals is usually that of Moses and Elijah because of what the text says they can do. I would tell you that they represent, I believe, the entire prophetic witness from Moses all the way to John, just as we've seen in chapter 10. Okay, so what we have here is the faithful witnesses. We have the 2. Some scholars believe they represent the Old and New Covenants, that the entirety of God's covenant there, and they're going to be a lot like Jesus here in just a few. Okay, so So that's what's happening here. So let's pick up in verse 7, and this will be the last section I'll try to cover tonight because it's 10 to 7, and I don't want you to have massive brain drain. Okay, so here we go. So when they finish their testimony, verse 7, the beast that comes up from the bottomless pit, you remember him, will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Egypt. Excuse me. See, that's just they go together like peanut butter and chocolate. Okay, there you go. Spaghetti and meatballs. There you go. All right. Sodom and Egypt. All right. I know, really? Yeah, maybe it's my brain that's getting drained. All right. Where also their Lord was crucified. We're going to come back to that because that's an interesting statement. For 3.5 days, members of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents because these two prophets had been a torment to the inhabitants of the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and those who saw them were terrified. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. At that moment, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. The third woe is coming very soon. All right. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to unpack here. The designation of Jerusalem as Sodom and Egypt is very interesting, but it is Jerusalem. And we know that because John tells us in verse 8, he says, where also their Lord was crucified. So he's speaking about Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was the site of both divine revelation, and it was the attempt to snuff out the source of that revelation, the prophets. Okay, it was that place. Jesus is the great prophet. The Gospels are careful, of course, not to limit Jesus to just being a prophet, because he's more than a prophet. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He says that himself in Matthew 5:17. He says, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill them." But he is still part of the prophetic tradition, and he suffers the prophet's normal fate, exile and death. So again, we've got some numbers here to look at. The numbers that we're going to look at here are the 3.5 days. Again, an incomplete amount of time. 3.5 days, not 7, but 3.5. So that's important for us to see. The other thing here that I'm just going to touch on and then move on about is, and we're going to stop here tonight because I'm going to stop here. I'm going to come back to this when we start next week. But one of the things that happens here is they are killed. The world seemingly rejoices, but then 3.5 days later, they're raised from the dead and they ascend. That sounds eerily familiar to me.
Yes, it does. That's resurrection.
Right. So you
They're
have,
already dead.
but you have death, and then God raises them from the dead, as He did Jesus, and then they ascend.
And remember, we heirs too now.
And that's the same thing that happened with Jesus.
But didn't they die a long time ago? Long time before this?
Well,
Don't know about Moses.
we're not thinking these are literally Moses and Elijah. Now Elijah didn't die. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a flaming chariot. Moses, we don't know. Moses was buried by God, and no one was ever allowed to know where his grave was because God didn't want that to become a shrine. So we don't know. We don't know what happened with
He didn't
Moses.
get a chance to go to the.
Yeah, and there are traditions in Israel that say that Moses was assumed, very much like Enoch was, who walked with God and then was no more because the Lord took him. That's not in your Bible, but that's some of the Jewish traditions around him. So, but there are similarities here to what happens to these two witnesses, these two lampstands, and what happens to Jesus. And so, faithful gospel witness then in the first century, And today, often you end up with, maybe you don't end up with physical death. I think in America, the worst thing you end up with is ridicule and people ignore you.
Yes, yes.
And by the way, neither of those are suffering. Not really. No, we don't need to confuse real suffering with being ignored and being ridiculed. That's different, you know. So, but anyway, I will come back to this next week, and we'll continue on with these two witnesses, and we'll dig into it. So, okay. All right, folks, thank you so much for being here tonight, and God bless you. Remember, stay faithful. And I love Mr. Potato Head. I'll see you guys later.
Me too.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a
Take
good night.
care.
and safe. God bless you.
You too now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.